So one thing that you won't see on Spencer's bio, but is on Spencer's mind, is that how after the pandemic, he hopes that we can all learn ways or continue to learn ways to be kinder to the environment. But he is looking forward to having more normal and less Netflix dependent dates with his wife as things start opening up. So one last thing before I pass it on to Spencer, as you have just seen, because it popped up for me, this message, this meeting is now being recorded. And so you will see that pop up on your screen. This is just so we can preserve some of these talks.
Wonderful, thank you so much. It's an honor to get the opportunity to present to an audience that I really revere. And so many of you have had such a huge impact on my career. This is an inductive study that I've been working on with colleagues, David Sluss at ESSEC, Jennifer Krakowski at Google, and Jessica Wisdom at Humu. And just to set the stage, and for the purposes of this talk and the constraints, I'm going to be mostly phenomenological with bits of theory kind of scattered in here. But when we think about hiring somebody new, we can see how heavily we look at experience and people being able to bring in lots of experience on their job. It also helps if they have a lot of expertise and thought leadership. And in some cases, just as a side joke, some jobs entail sitting. But really what I want to highlight here is the experience that we expect people to actually come in with lots and lots of ideas as newcomers. And what's interesting about that then is that we have a literature on socialization that looks almost wholly at reshaping individuals to be more like the organization without considering what sort of ideas they might bring with them. And then we have other literatures like the issue selling literature or even the creativity literature that looks at how ideas are shaped without fully considering how the shaping of ideas might change the individual. And what we're going to do in this study is kind of turn both those literatures on their head in a synergistic way and look at what happens when we take seriously the notion that we could actually learn a lot from the new people that are coming into our organizations and how that process might happen. So to do this, we embarked on an inductive study where we followed newcomers and people that worked closely with them over the course of an entire year, interviewing them at 3-month intervals and conducting over 163 interviews. What this allowed us to do was to establish a timeline of events to see how newcomers might try to bring in a new idea and how insiders might respond to that. So if we were to kind of animate this process, let's imagine the newcomer is the little circle and the insider is sort of the rounded rectangle there. And as you're someone new, you kind of feel, even though you're hired, you still feel maybe a little bit like an outsider. And so there's this boundary between yourself and feeling like you're inside and you understand the organization's knowledge. What we discovered was that there were some things that newcomers can do to showcase this sense of what we would call mutuality. And mutuality means I'm willing to learn from you, and I hope you might be willing to learn a little bit from me, mainly by showcasing cues that suggest a willingness to be humble and to be curious. And insiders responded to this by also showcasing mutuality by giving the newcomers a little bit of space, buffering them from some tasks, and maybe endorsing their outside experience so that others might be more open to listening to them. This then sets the stage for newcomers to do what we call tendering outside ideas. Now, in this case, I'm going to be focusing on the positive view of this process. We also have cases where newcomers would contend for new ideas. Listen to me, I came from IBM, I have 20 years of experience. On average, that doesn't go so well. And when newcomers tender these ideas, so they're kind of tentatively offering up a new way of thinking or a new way of doing things, insiders might then engage in what we call relational pinpointing. So what they say is, as part of our relationship together, I'm actually going to help you as the newcomer try to find resources that can help you place this idea inside our organization in the proper way. So one of those resources might be helping them understand the history of ideas that are similar to this so that they can understand how their idea compares to things that have been tried in the past. If this goes successful, then that resource is brought back to the idea and overlaid on it, and the idea begins to change its shape. And that might precipitate additional cycles of tendering and relational pinpointing, where the insiders are able to, through the relationship, help newcomers find resources like data that's native to the organization or materials to help them build prototypes, and potentially to build coalitions around this new idea and narrowcast this idea to select audiences that might be able to approve and support it. What's interesting then is that over time, through these cycles of newcomers tendering the idea and then relational pinpointing with insiders to find new resources for the idea, three really fun things happen. One is that the newcomer has a stronger sense of how the culture works in the organization because they've been able to work through it. Second, their idea emerges camouflaged as though it belonged in the new context from the beginning. And finally, the insiders themselves feel this renewal of the culture and feel more energized. So one of the things it suggests then is it's not just the idea or the individual pushing the idea, it's actually the relationship that helps the idea accepted. And it suggests this important notion of mutuality where ideas are brought in a way that honors what's already happened in the organization while also extending what the organization is capable of. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Spencer. Our third presentation is titled The Relational Architecture of Human Resource Management, Integrating POS and HR Research Through a Social Network Lens. And this will be presented by Jessica Methot, who is an Associate Professor of Human Resource Management in the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University, as well as a Distinguished Research Professor of Management at the University of Exeter Business School. Jessica conducts research at the intersection of interpersonal workplace relationships and social network dynamics, including how formal HR practices transform informal social networks, the functional and dysfunctional consequences of workplace relationships, and their temporal, multidimensional features. In the way of fun facts, Jess is looking forward to going to concerts again with her husband and kids. This is a summertime ritual they've enjoyed for many years, including visits to Dave Matthews Band and Jimmy Buffett and others. How cool of a parent is she? She is looking forward to not shaking hands after COVID. When she pointed it out, I agree that this is a really kind of weird ritual, touching strangers, but she would like to see the sustained investment in adopting dogs. So with that, without any more on that, Jess, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I feel like that sets a really weird stage for starting my presentation. But I really am excited to talk to you about this topic today. It's something that I've been passionate about for a while, have published in recently. But I was invited to talk today about my research on integrating the positive organizational scholarship and HR research through the lens of social network analysis. So as a social network analyst and as a positive organizational scholar, being housed in and working in an HR department, some of the observations about and the history of human resource management have really resonated with me. So in particular, for those of you who are familiar with HR research, HR is really deeply rooted in the idea of human capital. So really focused on developing individuals' knowledge, skills, capabilities. So how we can design human resource practices that can boost knowledge and skills, and how those individual knowledge and skills ultimately impact employees' attitudes and behaviors. But we also know, and as relationship scholars, that individuals don't work and don't operate in isolation. So scholars in the HR area have begun to acknowledge that HR strategies and practices have to transcend this focus on individual human capital to also focus on things like social capital, the relationships that people develop in organizations and outside organizations that help them gain access to resources and to develop and to perform well. And we can see kind of the thread with this focus on human capital and individuals when we think about the structure of organizations. So really typically we see a focus on organizational charts. When I talk to senior leaders and I ask them to kind of break down the structure of their organization, we typically see something like this: hierarchical structure with individuals clustered by their complementary human capital. So marketing departments, R&D departments, sales departments, IT departments. And they're grouped that way because they have similar backgrounds, similar training, similar knowledge and skills, and they're expected to be able to work together to get their jobs done. But we also know that that isn't really the way that people work in organizations. So people bridge those functional boundaries and divisions to become friends with people, to ask for feedback and advice, to gossip, to build trust, to collaborate, to brainstorm and become creative. And so this idea of adopting a social network analytic perspective in human resource management has started to take off. There were a few papers published in 2018 that were really good reviews and theories that kind of helped lay the foundation for this idea. But it really is helpful in advancing the resource in human resource management and allowing us to reorient our thinking from the individual to the collective or to the relational level. And this is because we know that social network analysis gives us an X-ray into the way that work is really getting done in organizations. So some studies that have been published over the past few years that have helped us kind of synthesize this idea and that have positioned the social fabric of organizations as a mediating mechanism or as that black box between the impact of HR practices and systems on individual, unit, and firm performance. So we know from this research that HR practices like recruitment and selection and training are able to complement, to cultivate, to subsidize, and even to disrupt employee relationships in organizations. And so there's been great research on social capital, people's positions in social networks, their centrality, their brokerage, relational coordination, and the architecture of roles, respectful interacting, and relational climates. We also know that there's a recursive relationship here as well, that patterns of informal interactions can impact how attributions of HR practices are formed. So individuals who are friends with each other tend to develop the same perceptions of human resource practices in organizations. And so I just wanted to kind of break down a few of the key reasons why I think adopting a social networks approach to the research in human resource management can really be of value. And so the first is that social network analysis is inherently multi-level. So we can look at relationships across different levels of analysis, the dyad level, the individual or inter-individual level, the inter-network or inter-unit level. There are also a lot of different prototypical contents of relationships. So the nature of the relationship, how we define that relationship, trust, distrust, like, dislike, friendship, boss, friend, co-membership on boards. Did we email each other? And then finally, that we can compute characteristics of relationships. So a relatively empirical or analytical take on how we can quantify relationships in organizations. Spencer was mentioning mutuality. So we can use the metric of reciprocity to capture mutuality in a network. And so to close, and just to be a little generative, to give you some ideas about where I see this research going, or some basic research questions that we might be able to ask, linking HR and relationships or taking a relational view of human resource management. If we were to position HR practices and systems as independent variables at the dyad, individual, and network level, do things like referral programs induce more similarity between individuals at the dyad? Does job rotation predict individuals' positions as brokers in a network? Are diversity management programs positively related to network heterogeneity? Or if we have relationships as the independent variables and HR practices as the outcomes, are workplace friends more likely to share perceptions of HR practices? Does network centrality impact voluntary turnover? And does greater network density, cohesion predict team performance? And we have some answers to these questions, but I think we can dive really deep and develop some really rich theory and research in this area. And as a final plug, really quick plug, if any of you are doing research in this area or interested in research in this area, I am guest editing a special issue in the journal Human Resource Management on relational perspectives of HR, and the deadline is July 31st. So please feel free to submit your work. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. Our fourth research brief is Learning as a Tool for Resilience by Chris Myers. Chris is an associate professor and academic director of executive education at the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. He has a joint faculty appointment with the School of Medicine and the Armstrong Institute for Patient Safety and Quality. His research explores questions of learning, development, and innovation in organizations, as well as how people learn vicariously from others' knowledge and experience at work. He focuses in particular on learning in healthcare organizations and other knowledge-intensive industries. So Chris told us that while he's really excited to visit China to see his family, he is, now that the pandemic restrictions are loosening up, he's hoping that one thing that will stick as we move into this next era is that more and more restaurants will do takeouts, because that is so important if you have little kids.
Thanks, Bree. I'm excited to get to talk with everybody today. And, I'm excited to share some ideas, some stuff that's in progress really, and has been for a while, on thinking about learning as a strategy for resilience and how bringing a positive organizational scholarship lens to this domain of inquiry, much like we were just hearing about with human resource management, learning is an area of inquiry that's kind of been viewed sort of very mechanically, very sort of very focused on how we move little bits of knowledge around the organization, but how bringing a positive organizational scholarship lens to that can help us think in more generative and different ways. And the reason that I connect this to resilience is that when we think about bouncing back and being resilient in organizations, this comes down to our ability to engage in effective learning. We're often thinking about how do we build on the things that we're already doing well, and then in particular, how do we bounce back from things that maybe didn't go so well? How do we learn from the lessons of our mistakes so that we can move forward? And we see this across a variety of domains. And as Bree sort of hinted, one that matters quite a bit to me here at Hopkins is in the healthcare domain. So with some wonderful colleagues, we were looking at how we've been able to respond resiliently in the face of COVID-19. And what it boils down to often is the ability to learn very quickly, to build both on the things that have gone well, but in particular to respond to things that have not gone well and adjust accordingly. And this value of learning from failure is something that we all sort of implicitly acknowledge, right? Our society celebrates failure as a teachable moment. We talk about failing forward. We talk about, how we can grow from our missteps. And yet, in a massive study that sort of replicated findings across a variety of other previous research efforts, we find that failure tends to do exactly the opposite of that. We tend to be pretty bad at learning from our failures. It's a little bit of a fail, if you will, right? But one of the things that we can start to identify to underpin why we're not so good at this comes from research on the fundamental attribution error. And there's sort of a growing consensus in this literature that part of the reason we don't learn from failure is that we attribute our failures to external causes, while we can attribute our successes to internal causes. And so we learn better from our own successes than our own failures. But interestingly, we do exactly the opposite with others. Because we attribute their poor performance to internal characteristics, we actually see some learning value from that. We see some things that could change, but we might be more likely to write off their successes as due to luck or good fortune. And what I love about bringing a positive organizational scholarship lens to this question is it invites us to flip the script a little bit. Right? When we view this through our hardcore TADA POS lens, right, we think about what might be ways that we can start expanding this range of experiences we could learn from. Because in both cases, we're cutting off half the value here. So how do we start focusing on others' positive outcomes, as well as learning from our own negative outcomes? And I was fortunate to work with Shirley Kopelman and Ryan Quinn and Steph Simmons on some really fun work that just came out in AMD earlier this year, looking at how clinicians and the general population are actually more motivated to learn from others' successes when these successes are sort of, positively deviant, right? When they are exceptionally positive outcomes that we might not have otherwise expected. So we start to see the value of focusing on this extreme end of the continuum of others' performance. But I really wanted to focus my work in an upcoming project on how we can further mine the value of our own poor performance and see if we can overcome some of these inherent limitations that we see in prior research. And so what we've been doing in this study is looking at the process of attribution and what would lead us to internally attribute our own negative performance. We've zeroed in on this idea of ambiguity as a big piece. When we're not quite sure, it's a little bit easier to externally attribute our failures. And so across 3 studies, one in the field with employees engaged in business process outsourcing work, which is very low ambiguity, clear right or wrong tasks. We observed that people do internally attribute their failures and actually learn more from them than their own successes, in contrast to what we saw in that kind of dominant stream of work. We looked at an online study where individuals completed a scenario doing the Carter racing task, which leads them to fail and they learn that they blew up the challenger, and then come back a week later and engage in another decision-making task. And there too, we see that individuals who internally attributed learned from that failure. And finally, in a task having people engage in a blood smear labeling exercise, we see very similar trends. So we're excited to see that it isn't always the case that we can't learn from our failure, but when we bring this positive lens and start thinking about the conditions under which we can make it happen, we're able to see more effective learning from that full range of experiences. And that can help us be more resilient. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, our final presentation is titled Harnessing the Power of Emotional Ambivalence and will be presented by Naomi Rothman, who is an associate professor at the Lehigh School of Business. She earned her doctorate from New York University. Her research examines the unexpected ways that people, especially leaders, make high quality decisions and influence others to do so through their use of emotions and power. Specifically, how the experience and expression of complex emotion, what she calls emotional ambivalence, and complex states of power, also known as power with perspective taking, drive effective decision making. One thing Naomi's looking forward to after the pandemic is to have reunions with the women friends and colleagues who have virtually carried her, and I will say many of us, through this ordeal, embracing all of our emotions, including our ambivalent emotions. And one change that she made that she hopes will stick was prioritizing health. So thank you, Naomi.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be back in the POS community. So I want you to recall a time in your life in which you felt really ambivalent, a time maybe when you felt really happy and sad at the same time about a person, situation, object, event, or idea. I wouldn't be surprised if you look back at an event that happened to you during the pandemic. As you endured the public health crisis, were there moments when your partner, your children, your job elicited feelings of being torn, conflicted, or mixed? Maybe the ambiguity of ever-changing rules and norms for staying safe made you feel torn and conflicted about some decision you were making, like whether you should go to the grocery store or go on a trip. Or maybe you've cultivated emotional ambivalence in yourself as an emotional hedge in the face of uncertainty about how to make social and political change happen faster. Maybe this has become your most typical way of feeling in response to other people, situations, events, or ideas lately. Maybe it's how you really feel when a colleague asks, "How are you doing?" in a work Zoom meeting. It's clear that many people are feeling some of the most complex emotions of their lives and are just now awakening to the fact that simultaneously feeling positive and negative emotions is possible. So simultaneously. So how did you respond though? My last question, when your colleague asked, "How do you feel?" Did you tell the colleague that you had ambivalent feelings, or did you hesitate? Maybe your answer depended on your relationship with that colleague. Are you close? Do they tend to embrace emotional ambivalence? Or maybe you didn't want to taint the mood or appear emotionally vulnerable, like you kind of didn't have it together in that moment. Your concerns about sharing your emotional ambivalence with a competitive colleague would not be unwarranted. I found in my dissertation research that people behaved more dominantly towards interaction partners who expressed emotional ambivalence in a video prior to their interaction. They not only intended to be more closed-minded to their ambivalent partners' contributions in an upcoming meeting, but they actually also took more money from them in an ultimatum bargaining game. And this was because they perceived them as less powerful. The reality, though, is that sharing your emotional ambivalence with others can also be an invitation for co-creation. So in some follow-up research, dyads in which emotional ambivalence was expressed prior to the negotiation created the highest total value, significantly more than dyads in which anger or neutrality was expressed. So what explains these positive effects? We made sure in these studies that ambivalence was shared in the context of supportive and cooperative relationships. And in that environment, sharing emotional ambivalence was actually able to unleash problem solving that made everybody better off. So considering the amount of emotional ambivalence that we're seeing lately, an interdisciplinary team of scholars and I are studying how to help leaders and organizations harness the benefits of emotional ambivalence and avoid the risks. My research and negotiation context suggested that supportive, cooperative relationships were really important, but there's still a whole lot to learn about this question. And so we're looking at a slightly unorthodox place, which are moderated Instagram mom groups. Ethnographically, we noticed that the prevalence of emotional ambivalence in this population is quite high. There are many emergent virtual communities for mothers to gather with one another, and the leadership norms and emotional cultures of these groups vary widely. And so they're a really rich source of data. At a very high level, what we have found is that some groups and leaders really embrace, model, and encourage the sharing of emotional ambivalence on their page. The leadership is also able to facilitate the sharing and processing of emotional ambivalence directly in these talking circles. They actually resemble therapists. And we have a clinical psychologist on our team. Other groups really embrace positivity. But even those have changed over the past year and a half to emulate the other groups. And finally, it seems as though the forums that kind of allow people to safely express their emotional ambivalence are actually thriving in ways that the other communities are not. Their numbers are increasing and the number of likes that we're observing are also really high. So the reason an organization might right now want to focus on the conditions that harness emotional ambivalence is that experiencing emotional ambivalence appears to be an affective mechanism, enabling people to flexibly respond and adapt to complex, contradictory, and changing circumstances, which might help leaders be more strategically adaptable. It can also help increase positive adaptation in employees. Shimul Mawani and I, along with her amazing doctoral student, Alyssa Tedder-King, collected 2 surveys of working mothers during COVID and found that emotional ambivalence is a mechanism explaining why mothers who've had to endure immense amounts of multitasking in the last year and a half are in fact able to engage in increased renegotiation of their work and role re-engagement. So we also know that emotional ambivalence cultivates seeing the bigger picture, asking for help from others when making difficult decisions, and providing help to others when needed. It can also reduce white people's levels of defensive responding to race IAT feedback by approximately 6%, regardless of their initial prejudicial attitudes, which in turn makes them more aware of bias in themselves and others, and makes them have more positive attitudes about anti-bias interventions. In conclusion, if you think about the type of openness, the type of radical interdependence and collaborative problem solving that is really necessary to solve some of the major challenges that our world faces, feeling and sharing your emotional ambivalence may be one simple step on that path. As environmentalist Dakila Chung-Yalpa explains, we are out of time for hubristic battle when it comes to the climate crisis. We need to think of ourselves collectively to come up with solutions. And I think the research is now convincing that harnessing our emotional ambivalence by creating organizational cultures, leaders that embrace ambivalent feelings in themselves and in others is a promising path for the type of collaborative and interdependent problem solving that we really need to see more of. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi. And I just want to take a minute to thank all of our 5 presenters for their fabulous research presentations. You guys did an amazing job in adhering to those strict rules of just 5 minutes. And I hope that this does create room for more conversations about these topics. Please, again, feel free to reach out to the presenters to continue these conversations, and we'll do all we can to facilitate that.